Hello, and a very good morning, everyone from the UK. And good afternoon to all of you who are joining us from Asia. And we also have participants coming in from the Americas. It's a very late night for you, so thank you for staying up this late with us and sharing with us your thoughts on migrant rights for this important corridor. So we're here today for a joint Institute for Human Rights and Business and FairSquare event titled Fair Recruitment in Review, Philippines to Taiwan, Falling Through the Cracks, ? My name is Bonnie Ling Yihua, and I am a research fellow with the Institute for Human Rights and Business. And I've worked with the team at the Migrant Workers Program to push for greater awareness on fair recruitment in order to bring about a global system where no one pays for securing his or her job, and no one's indebted for the promise of a job abroad. Now, 2 years ago, we added the Chinese traditional version of the Dhaka principle for migration with dignity to the repository of the principle in different languages. And I think there are now about 30 versions in various languages. And migration with dignity being so important to the topic that we're examining today on fair recruitment. But before we delve into the panel, a few housekeeping matters up front. So first of all, this session is being recorded, and the video will be made available and put up on the website of the Institute for Human Rights and Business and FairSquare. And also, today's webinar will be in English, but translation between English and Chinese will be available throughout. Now, all participants, please select your language of preference. If you go to the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen, you can click on the small globe icon, and there you can select your language option. I will remain in English, but I'm going to just break into Chinese for a second for our Chinese listeners. 今天的讨会将会用英文进行，可是会提供中文翻译。这个频道是英文频道，如果您想要听中文，请您去荧幕下的小地球图标，然后在那里您可以选中文频道。Yeah. If there's any question, please type in with the chat, and the comms team, the wonderful comms team, will be there to help you with technical difficulties. Now, as it is often the case with such a distinguished panel of speakers, the challenge for me as the moderator today will be timekeeping. We hope to allow for plenty of time towards the end for questions to generate a very rich Q&A with the panelists today. So with that in mind, we will devote the last 30 minutes of the webinar for a general discussion. And the first hour will be for our panelists. Now, please submit your questions via the Q&A box. And I will put as many of these possible to the panel. Now, where the questions are directly addressed to the speakers right after their presentation, I will try to squeeze them in before the next speaker starts. Otherwise, we will get to the questions in due course for the general discussion. And just from the conversations we had between all of us prior to the webinar start, there's going to be lots to talk about, things that we can tease out from the FairSquare report. And also feel free to put down your observations and comment in the chat. Now, for our Chinese listeners, feel free to join the discussion. You can type in Chinese in the chat. We have plenty of bilingual speakers, and if you have the time to our bilingual speakers, please feel free to just jump in and quickly translate that into English if you don't mind, so that we can have a very full and very multi-layered discussion amongst all of our attendees today. Now, for questions that remain unanswered, we will publish answers to select questions afterwards, and we'll post them onto the websites of both organizations. So do put down your questions, do put down your comments, and this is just the beginning of a very long conversation, very long, rich conversation. So we have here today a really great group of people. joining us, listening in, and also on the panel. We have scholars who have worked on, this corridor and broadly on migrant rights issue in the region and internationally for a long time. We have people from civil society, we have governments, we have international organizations, people from business. And the aim for our webinar today is that we all bring such a unique perspective to the discussion. And by bringing them all together in this room, we can create a much more nuanced and realistic 3D rendering of the issues presented in the FairSquare report. Now, without further ado, let's jump straight into the topic at hand today. And by turning into the writer of this 100-page plus report on fair recruitment between the Philippines and Taiwan. So Nicholas McGeehan is the founding director of FairSquare's Research and Projects, an NGO, nonprofit human rights organization that works to develop solutions to important and complicated human rights issues. FairSquare produces specialized research and advice to help prevent abuse and to promote accountability in the rule of law. Nick was previously a senior researcher at Human Rights Watch, where he conducted research and advocacy on abuses in agriculture supply chain and heat-related death in construction. He has a PhD in international law on slavery, forced labor, and human trafficking, and he's also a prolific writer and commentator. Now, Nick, I have an image of you drinking cups and cups of oolong tea as you power through the writing of this long and meticulous, significant report, so rich in the amount of details for this specific corridor. One does wonder whether or not you picked up Chinese, along the way. Because the research was very deep. Congratulations for that. Now, don't worry, audience. I think FairSquare has posted summaries of this report on your website, and you can refer to that. But as I was reading the report, a question that came to me, and I think it would help us to frame the discussion that we have today, is the Philippines is a country known for its extensive outward labor migration. It's well documented, has been going on for many decades. Because it started in around the 1970s. Now, a significant portion of the Filipino population work abroad, and that's believed to be around, I think, like 5% of the total population, with the US being the most common destination, followed by many others, those in the Gulf state, Canada, Australia, Japan, and so forth and so forth. I think there are about 100 countries where they are overseas Filipino workers. In comparison, Taiwan only has 4 labor migration corridors. So beyond the Philippines, there's a corridor with Thailand, Indonesia, and Vietnam. So I guess the obvious question to start with is, given all the corridor permutations possible, why this particular corridor? Why Philippines to Taiwan? Maybe you can speak to the rationale for choosing this particular corridor amidst all the other possible combinations, and talk a little bit about the general features of this corridor. Why were you interested? And paint us an overview in terms of the sectors of work that Filipino workers are usually engaged in Taiwan. And then I'm going to throw you the word in the title of the webinar. When you talk about fair recruitment, what do you mean by that? What is it we're looking at today? So 7 minutes, Nick. Thank you.
Thanks, Bonnie. I particularly like your imagery of me writing this report, which is 100% accurate, of course. I'll zoom out a little bit. And first of all, yes, I drafted a lot of the report, but it would be remiss of me not to mention the amazing help we had in doing this. Mina Chiang, William Ragamat, fantastic research from them. Also the amazing help we got from lots of people on this call who are really the experts on this, Bonnie, Len, Ellen, Marie, you know, I mean, and a whole host of others who I just don't have time to thank for that. Even Howard, who our translator, who was present at a trip in Taiwan in February 2020, just before the pandemic. And it's a great opportunity to meet fantastic new people when you delve into these new subject areas or new regions. Just on the project as a whole, this was a bigger project in Philippines, Taiwan. This 5 Corridors project grew from the belief that states were not really doing enough on the issue of recruitment, that the onus had been heavily on the private sector. IHRB, to whom we owe great thanks for helping organize this, have done great work on this. You know, the establishment of the employer pays principle owes so much to them. But that focus on the private sector, while incredibly welcome, we felt was missing the complement of state action. Recruitment is so vital to ethical migration. And with states investing so heavily in these forms of temporary or circular migration, we felt it was important that there be rigorous standards and that we be able to show that there are states showing leadership on this issue. What do we mean by fair recruitment? I'm just jumping to your second question. Well, we thought it was important to take a broad view of this issue. You can think about recruitment as fees and contracts, but we felt that wouldn't necessarily be all that helpful, and that would leave the onus simply on origin states, you know, to effectively or place a heavy onus on them to sort out this problem. But recruitment is a cycle, and how can fair recruitment, you know, how can recruitment be fair if you're not looking at working practices in destination states? You know, if it doesn't matter if you haven't paid a recruitment fee, if you're placed into a labor system that denies you all rights and discriminates against you. So we felt it was important that we take a fairly broad view of that, and anyone who's more interested can look at the methodology that we adopted. In general, we felt that there was a lack of an evidence base in terms of it wasn't really possible to say what states were doing well and to compare states. There were certainly ILO guidelines for states on fair recruitment, but that was these are very lengthy, and it wasn't at all clear that states had any sense of which ones of those they should prioritize. So we felt research that looked across a range of corridors and drew out a framework on fair recruitment, that by doing that, we could develop recommendations to states as to how they should, you know, how they could recruit more fairly. Which I guess brings us to why the Philippines and why Taiwan. Well, Bonnie, as you so rightly pointed out, the Philippines could not be ignored, I think, in this. Similarly, Mexico could not be ignored, which is why one of the corridors was Mexico to Canada. You know, the Philippines is always held up as the gold standard for origin states, I think. We hear that a lot. I mean, I recall doing research in Ethiopia, and Ethiopian domestic workers talking about the incredible support that their Filipino counterparts got in the Gulf states compared to them, you know, and wishing that they had the same level of consular support, the same overseas bureaucracy that was in place to protect Filipinos for them. But there is a slight contradiction, of course, and if you talk to any Filipino experts like Ellen or Marie, for example, it becomes quite clear that despite some lofty rhetorical commitments and despite a very impressive foreign bureaucracy and a very impressive set of laws, there's still a lot of Filipino workers, migrant workers, who are seriously abused, and the recruitment process is part of that. And of course, the Philippines sends, I think it's about 50% of its overseas workers to the Gulf states, where we know that recruitment is deeply unfair, and where we know that laws and policies and practice are deeply repressive. So how do you square that? How do you square this state, which is on the one level so impressive, with this idea that it's, you know, with the fact rather that it's sending so many workers to the Gulf? So yeah, we wanted to look into that issue of the Philippines. We wanted to see how effective is it really in practice, you know, and to answer that broader question, what exactly can origin states do? here, you know, in this issue, where this issue is concerned. So I'll leave it to Ellen and Marie to probably talk more about, you know, what the Philippines is doing and where the problems lie. Taiwan. Taiwan was the last country to be chosen for this, and I'm really delighted we did. What we found was that authorities, the government was very engaged to meet with us, pleased to meet with us, in fact, which stood in contrast to many of the other countries where we researched. They provided us with data. They sat down and talked to us openly and frankly about their approach, where they felt progress had been made and where they acknowledged shortcomings. I mean, it is a fascinating place to do research, and I think we felt very encouraged in discussions beforehand that it was the right place to go. Numerous experts in the field talked to us about the great work that's being done in the electronics sector. Although at the same time, you know, we spoke to lots of voices who expressed deep caution so as not to exaggerate the progress there, because we know there remain big problems in Taiwan. The most obvious problems lying in perhaps the distant water fishing sector, which has been extensively studied and documented. You know, Greenpeace, for example, have done just tremendous work on that issue. So we felt it would be wise for us not to necessarily focus on that, but to focus on the other sectors in Taiwan where foreign workers are used: manufacturing, domestic work, and the domestic fishing sector. I guess I'm conscious of my time here. I'm going to leave it to the real experts to dig into the detail, but there's one issue that always stuck with me from this corridor, and I wanted to raise here because I think it illustrates it illustrates part of the problem here. The Taiwan Legal Aid Foundation, in an interview with them, referred me to the fact, and I struggled to believe it at the time, that Filipino workers in Taiwan have court orders made by Taiwanese lending agents to deduct money from their salaries every month, based on the fact that Taiwanese lending agencies buy debt from Filipino lending agencies and then leverage that debt against the foreign workforce. Taiwanese courts can challenge these debt repayments, but only on the basis of the interest paid, not on the basis of the very fact of this happening. And it was a case that, yeah, it still sticks with me to this day, because despite all of the deeply impressive work that is being done on both sides of this migration corridor, it illustrates that there remain serious problems. It's maybe not the only example, it's certainly not the only example, but it is one that shows that both the authorities in the Philippines and Taiwan probably still have quite a lot to do to really implement fair recruitment in this corridor. So I'll leave it there and hand over.
Thank you, Nick, for that great opening, kind of inviting us to kind of probe a little bit deeper, you know, behind the rhetoric of Philippines as sending state and also destination Taiwan. And I think a couple of things you said really stuck out for me. One is the importance of legal aid, you know, in terms of access to remedy. There's been some very, you know, very innovative work done by the Taiwan Legal Aid Foundation to assist specifically in migrant workers. It's a targeted programming focused on the issue of debt and court challenges, which I hope Lenham can also talk about. But I think now there's so much to probe, but let me turn the floor to Ellen Sana, our next speaker. It's nice to see you on screen. Now, Ellen Sana is well known for her years of advocacy at local, national, regional, and international forum on migrant rights. Doesn't really need much of introduction. She's the executive director of the Center for Migrant Advocacy, a Philippine-based non-governmental organization that works for the rights and welfare of Filipino migrant workers and their families. She currently serves as the migrant labor representative for the Philippines National Tripartite Industrial Peace Council, and is a permanent member and migrant labor representative of the government's Decent Work Advisory Committee. She is secretary of Philippine Migrant Rights Watch and a supervisory group member of the Migrant Forum Asia. as well as being a member of a local program implemented by UN Women and the ILO focusing on female migrant workers. Ellen, I was surprised to find out that you were actually trained as a civil engineer, but instead of building physical bridges, which is tough enough already, I think you have the much harder job now of building bridges, to bring about a global system of migration based on dignity and rights. Now, I want to kind of pose the question to you, which picks up so well on Nick's point about Filipino labor migration to other countries, and how it's considered to be a gold standard in terms of protecting the rights of its workers abroad. When we think about issues like recruitment fees and working conditions, how do Filipino migrant workers' experience in Taiwan fit within this broader international context of outward migration for the Philippines? How do they compare to Filipino labor migration to the Gulf states? Is it better? Is it worse? Are there similarities? Are there major differences? And if there are differences, what do you think are the reasons for these differences? Ellen.
Thank you, Bonnie, and good afternoon in Asia, and probably good morning or good evening in the other parts of the globe. And thank you for the opportunity to take part in this webinar. Of course, I fully supported the research conducted by FairSquare on this. And I also agree for choosing Taiwan in relation to the issue of placement fees. As many of you would know, since the 1980s, a very recurring issue, long-standing issue of Filipino migrant workers into Taiwan is the excessive fee collection. So we have standards or regulations in the Philippines that can allow collection of placement fees equivalent only to a maximum of 1 month's salary. But apparently, when we make initial inquiries with our government, how come people going to Taiwan ended up paying so much, more than 100,000 or maybe 200,000? And this is, of course, one reason why they get into very, very heavy indebtedness and resulting to bonded labor. And so one short answer is it's a special market. So I don't really understand what we mean by special market for Taiwan. But for sure, one thing that I can note, and this is also to go now to your question, Bonnie, is I can see that it is special in the sense that, can you imagine Taiwan compared to our deployment to the Gulf? It's smaller in numbers, but of course, it's still very, very big numbers compared to the other countries of origin sending to Taiwan. We have 3 full offices, labor offices. So Kaohsiung and Taichung and Taipei. In Saudi, where we have more than 1 million migrant workers, and it's a very big country, 6 times the size of the Philippines. And every year, the highest deployment is to that country. We also have 3 labor offices. So 3 labor, but then in Taiwan, we have 3 MECO offices. In Saudi, we only have the embassy in Riyadh, and we have the consulate in Jeddah. So you can already see that what's in Taiwan, what's with Taiwan, that we have all these protection mechanisms. And you said, Bonnie, we are the gold standard. What I would pick up in that sentence is we are approaching the 50th year of overseas employment. And definitely a lot of things are still falling. Well, people are falling into the cracks. No, like a lot of abuses continue to happen, particularly to the low-skilled, low-paid migrant workers. And this would include one similarity between the Gulf and Taiwan: care workers, domestic workers, and as you call it in Taiwan, the caretakers. We call it in other places the caregivers, those who take care of the elderly people. And what's the difference? What's the similarity in terms of the recruitment and the living and working conditions for the workers in the care economy? A lot of them in the Gulf are live-in, and I think in Taiwan also are live-in. The difference also is you're talking of huge houses for domestic workers in the Gulf. so as big as malls, no? But I think in Taiwan is relatively smaller places to clean. Yeah, so like I think, but it matters. I think it is important to mention the sizes of the households, and the fact that in many of the Gulf states, the experience of these workers they are being lent to their other family members, and they are made to also do housework and not being paid for that. Of course, even if they are being paid, they are forced to do that. That is not acceptable, no? In Taiwan, I think there is also regulation that they should not be doing work for other employers. But of course, legal framework also dictates that if you check the legal framework for the Gulf states, many of the Gulf states, they prohibit collection of placement fees. And it's only like one-time payment that the prospective migrants would think about. And every month of their salary, they get it in full. Supposedly, that's what the law says. And of course, what is really scandalous in Taiwan is that not only do they have to pay a lot, including for training fees as they are processing their application, but once they arrive in Taiwan, there is that monthly deduction, which to us is quite unique in Taiwan, because in other places, and as you said, Filipinos are in it's not more than 100, it's more than 238 countries and territories around the globe. And it is only in Taiwan where migrants are deducted on a monthly basis. And that is something that I don't understand why we have agreed to that arrangement with Taiwan. And can you imagine in the report of Nick, he says that last in 2019, about 80% of the salary of the migrants went to brokers, for the fees. So you're already paying so much prior to deployment, and then you are also paying as you complete your 3-year work employment, your contract.
Thank you so much. There's so much to tease out in your introduction remarks. So I'll just focus on 3 things. One is the presence of the 3 Filipino labor the labor offices, and that doesn't seem to be correlated in any to the size of the labor migrant population in the destination. You'd be curious to find out what are the criteria used for the number. Why is Taiwan so special, considered so special? I agree with you. That is an open question. The 2 thing that I also picked out is you mentioned a point of technicality. It's so interesting, but it's so deeply hidden in the laws and the regulations, which is very complicated to wade through, and which is this prohibition on taking fees from an employer that exceeds the first month's salary of the migrant workers. And in some ways this was put in to kind of, cap the fees so that the workers don't have to pay excessive fees. But in so doing, by making it such a hard prohibition, and the costs do not actually reflect the full cost of recruitment, it could be seen as a barrier to ethical recruitment, because it's not sufficient to cover the full cost of recruitment if we were to do it properly. So that's a second point. It's a technicality, but I think one that came up in the report, but also for those of us who have been looking at this space, looking at things in the law that makes it hard for ethical recruiters to answer. And the third thing is something that on monthly service charges, we're going to ask Lennon to actually address it. So let me give the floor to Lennon, but before I do that, there's a little technical glitch today with attendees' names not showing. You're all showing up as someone else. So we have no idea who you are if you type in your questions. So if I could just ask you, would you type your questions, just put your name and your organization so that we can at least know who you are. Yeah, please. So now, thank you, Anna. So now we have Lennon, Wang Yingda. Lennon is the director of the Department of Policies on Migrant Workers of a local NGO in Taiwan, Serve the People Association based in Taoyuan. Serve the People runs shelters for migrant workers, and some of whom have lodged complaints against their employers. Serve the People Association not only provides shelter for these vulnerable workers needing a place to stay, but you also help them with their complaint and follow up on their individual cases. While Lennon is a prominent advocate for migrant workers in Taiwan. He has more than 10 years of experience of working with migrant workers, but also in the broader, trade union movement in Taiwan. And, focusing on things like improving the working and living conditions for all workers. And Lennon, I think we've been waiting for your remarks because we're all circling around the things that I know you're going to talk about on the local aspects of recruitment in Taiwan. This thing called monthly service charges that Ellen said is very unique to Taiwan. What is this monthly service charge? What do you get for service? And what do you think are the impact of these fees on migrant workers' overall treatment in Taiwan? And if you could also just briefly also cover on ways that Philippines and Taiwan have thought to address this through a system called direct hiring. It's a bilateral mechanism to kind of bypass brokers. If you can talk about, is that working? Why is it not working? But first, I want you to start talking about monthly service charges. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Bonnie, and everyone. I try to make it as quick as possible because there are too many things to answer. Yeah, well, thanks for Nick for this wonderful research and targeting on the recruitment fee. It's always one of the most fundamental source of the exploitation of migrant workers. And on the local so-called service fee, actually that's local brokers fee, there is an evolution of this service fee. Long time ago, there's no such a thing. Maybe like 20 years ago when I first interviewed and mingled with the migrant workers, there was no such a thing. There was a super big loan bigger than now. So at that time, all of the migrant workers in the first year, they have to pay most of their salary to the loan, maybe like 10,000 or more than 10,000 NT dollars, to the loan. So almost for a full year, or sometimes even longer than full year, like they cannot get anything. There's very little left. And more than I think around 15 years ago, the then Council of Labor Affairs, which is named Minister of Labor, MOL, they changed the system, changed the law, and they did two things. One is they legalized the local service fee, and actually we call it legalization of the broker's fee. They just actually simply made the bigger loan smaller and make the loans separate into 3 years. So in the 3 years, in the first year, they have to pay 1,800 per month. In the second year, 1,700. In the third year, 1,500. And the remaining years, always 1,500 if there is a broker. So in the first 3 years, they have to pay 60,000 NT dollars. That's equivalent to 2,152 US dollars. That's a big money, actually. And don't forget, they have to pay the first placement fee, as everyone mentioned. So what is this service fee? According to the Ministry of Labor, this is only, the brokers, they can charge only if there's a service. And so they cannot charge if there's no service. And there's a cap. The cap is what I described. But if you ask any migrant worker who has a broker, they always charge. It doesn't matter if there's any service. And on the top of that, if they really need some service, like taking them to see the doctor, taking them to have a medical check, or help them to renew their passport or ARC, that's the ID for foreigners, they have to pay again. So actually, the monthly service fee is fixed. Actually, it's totally different from what MOL said. It's a fixed rate. and there is another service charge, and it's so-called agreed by all the associations of brokers. So this is, I will say, frankly, this is a totally a legalization of the service fee, of the placement fee, and they just made it. But actually, the placement fee they deducted before from abroad, it's not smaller, as Ellen mentioned, and also everyone also understand it, that they have a loan. They have to pay a big loan. We're talking about the Philippines. Okay, so almost all of them, they have to pay a big loan in the Philippines, and they are forced to sign a promissory note, which was mentioned by Nick. So this is a whole exploitation system connived by brokers and employers and the legal system, the judicial system. So once they fail to pay back, well, their broker, their lending company, they always have two different legal bodies, one in the Philippines, one in Taiwan, but actually they're owned by the same company. And some of the lending companies are owned by the brokers. Like one of the most prominent, eCash or Global Finance, is owned by one of the biggest agency in Taiwan, Li Tong. That's the boss of this lending company. They borrow money to the migrants on right hand and take money back from the left, and it's a loan shark. All of them, the interest rate is as much as 60 to 70% a year. That's terribly high. And once they fail to pay, it'll be charged by force by the court. And even they pay half, the court will still ask them to pay from the beginning. That's how terrible it is. And quickly to the second question from Bonnie, the direct hiring center, actually, we all had a big hope on that, but it turned out to be not that useful. There are many reasons. Taiwan government doesn't really promote it very hard. There has been several direct hiring offices all over Taiwan, but now they cancel everyone. Only one in Taipei was remained. And from the foreign side, for example, Indonesian government, they don't do that at all. Actually, they only do some factories. And to the Philippines, it seems they allow. But actually, if you go to MECO office, it's not that friendly. They will say, I just go to the direct hiring center. There is a platform from the MOU between Taiwan and the Philippines on the website. So theoretically speaking, every Filipino worker who wants to come to Taiwan, they can register on that website. But I can confess to you, my relatives, okay, the relatives of my wife, they try to register, but after registering on that website, they didn't get anything. So there's no news. So it means it's only a fake platform. If they really want to come to Taiwan to work, they still have to go to one of the agencies. But luckily, if they are lucky enough, they work on those RBA companies. I mean, the companies who produce for the RBA brands, their placement fee might be refunded partly or most part of it, but not all of them are refunded. So I won't have a big dream on that. And there's other alternatives or channels. One is from the due diligence and brand audit. If we can really facilitate, really enforce the due diligence and a brand audit, and to ensure all the brands will require their supplier. I mean, so that's the companies in Taiwan, the employers in Taiwan, they pay the placement fee. They pay all the expenses of the recruitment process. That is fair. At least for me, that's fair recruitment. It means the workers, they don't need to pay. Another channel, which is also possible, and we are also trying, is a non-profit agency. Taiwan government offered this channel, but because this is too risky and we don't know the know-how, NGOs like us, we know how to advocate, we know how to push the government, but we don't really know how to do business. If we don't want to exploit the migrants and we don't want to be bankrupt, how to run it? Actually, we don't really know the know-how, but we are trying. So my organization and several others, we already applied this nonprofit agency from MOL. I hope we will do something differently. Yeah, that's my answer. Thanks.
Thank you, Lennon. Wow, so much rich detail also in your 7 minutes. So let me just start with the terminology on service fees. I always think sometimes like the naming makes it more acceptable by framing it as service. But in what you just described, it is not much service, right? And yet it's a very significant portion of their monthly wage. I think it comes, depending on which sector the migrant worker is in, the deduction for monthly service charges is anywhere between 7 to 10%. And I always think about what is that wage loss? You know, what are the things that could be done if that was remitted back home for human development back in the Philippines, you know, back in the home countries. So I think it's important to kind of look at labeling and to be firm that service charge is recruitment fees. It's part of recruitment fees, even though sometimes these things are lost in the translation. Yeah, thank you also for your description and criticisms of the of the bilateral direct hiring platform, a solution that's put forward to kind of bypass the brokers, and in so doing, you know, we kind of solve the recruitment problem in principle. But I just want to stress that, and this is also mentioned in Nick's report, that it doesn't solve this monthly service charges, even with direct hiring. The migrant workers, even if they go through direct hiring, they still have to pay monthly service charges in Taiwan. So, you know, even in this, you know, ideal scenario, there's still very serious gaps. So that's a perfect segue for Marie, you know, before we all lose hope. So it's incumbent on Marie now to kind of put hope back in us for how can we begin to fix it? How do we walk out of this maze? Now, Maria Posto is the founder and president of the Fair Hiring Initiative in the Philippines. And your organization promotes safe, fair, and legal recruitment under an employer pays policy, which means that the cost of recruitment is picked up by the employers, which is the standard that we use for professionals. And it doesn't make sense that we ask migrant workers who are the most vulnerable to pay the cost of their own recruitment. Now, Marie, you have a long history of working in this area. You spearheaded supply chain initiatives globally to address recruitment-related debt bondage and modern-day slavery. You have trained and consulted for global brands in the improvement of internal and supply chain systems for managing corporate responsibility and social risks. You were previously the founder and executive director of Verite Southeast Asia, which provided consulting, training, and assessment to brands in corporate responsibility, helping them to address social risks that may arise in their complicated supply chains. Now, prior to Verite, you were an independent consultant on poverty alleviation and social reform, and worked extensively with the government, bilateral funding agencies, international NGOs, and UN agencies. So I think we are, you know, parked at a perfect place for you to take us forward and say, given the challenges so far that we have identified, what are the opportunities and, you know, challenges for recruitment in this corridor? Should efforts be concentrated on improving the bilateral direct hiring platform to make it work better? Or is the solution in private sector initiatives or in the NGO initiatives that Lennon had talked about? Now, the second part of this, you know, please bring us hope segment from Marie is we talk a lot about barriers that ethical recruiters face in entering the market in the Philippines, in the country of origin. What could authorities in the destination, like Taiwan, what could they do to make it easier for ethical recruiters to operate in the sending state? So Marie, on to you.
No pressure, Bonnie. I have to bring the hope. Wow. No, I thank you for that introduction. It makes me seem a bit to have done a lot more than maybe I have. I came to these issues from a different pathway from Eleni and Lennon, both of whom I respect so highly, and I think they've done so much work. But I worked at it from with my work in Verite, and we work in government supply chains. We did do the audits that Lennon talks about in that brands do, and for a long time, I think Taiwan was where I started learning about forced labor of this kind, because when we were doing a lot of audits there in 1990, as early as 1999, right? We were already seeing that, Filipino workers, Vietnamese workers, Thai workers, they were paying so much money just to get a job in these companies that we were in, the supplier companies that the companies that supplied to the companies that we were auditing for. And even at that time, it wasn't seen as a forced labor issue. It wasn't seen by the broad spectrum of stakeholders as a forced labor issue. It was just the way things were done. And I think we started seeing that, we started putting it as a forced labor issue in our audit reports. One, because forced labor is a zero tolerance issue for a lot of brands, and it really brought it to the top of a company's list of things to address if you're seeing it as a forced labor issue. But more than that, I think we were seeing that we were seeing how the broker system itself, it was really the broker system, not just in Taiwan, but in the sending countries that were creating the issue because of the debt. And we were seeing that migrant workers, foreign workers in Taiwan, we were seeing Vietnamese workers paying $8,000 to get a job that paid them at that time about $550 a month. And we were seeing Filipino workers paying about $3,000, $4,000 for the same jobs. We made a breakthrough in 2007 when one of the brands that we were auditing for actually said, how do I get out of debt, having debt bondage in my supply chain? And we told them, well, you could pay the workers back and start making sure that workers are getting, that your suppliers are paying for recruitment and not workers. And this company actually took that forward and started making its suppliers pay workers back the money that they had put up in the sending countries. So I think that was a big step, and that led to what Lennon talked about in terms of the RBA, as an industry, because the company that we worked with was part of that industry. And that sort of changed things, for people started seeing it as forced labor. People started seeing it as a slavery issue. And I think that recognition by business, I think there's still a long way to go. RBA has been a pioneer, but frankly, I think maybe only of 5 or 10% of the membership actually really work on to make sure that their suppliers are paying for these costs. So there's still a long way to go. I think there's a lot of hope there. There's a lot of advocacy yet for civil society to keep pushing. I think there's a lot of hope in terms of, for example, the levers that we have. For example, the U.S. the U.S. tariffs law, where the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol is issuing withhold release orders on companies that on products that entered the United States that were allegedly reported by stakeholders as having been produced by forced labor. This is really creating a big leverage to address migrant worker fees in a lot of sectors like fisheries, the deep water fisheries that Nick is talking about. I think the CBP is scrutinizing that industry more and more now. They've already looked at palm oil in Malaysia, and they're looking at that. So there are these leverages. And I think that, because you told me to talk about hope, These are things that we need to use, right? That we need to use. In terms of the actual question that you had for me, I think, direct hiring. I think we need to look at why companies aren't using it more. I know of one company that actually decided, because they were being made to pay by their suppliers for recruitment costs. It forces companies to start looking for less expensive ways of doing that. If I'm a company and I have to pay for those costs, I'm going to look for a less expensive way of doing it. And going through the direct hiring program is certainly a less expensive way of doing it, because the Philippine government does not charge a fee. And that's why the private recruitment agencies are up in arms about it, because it's not an even playing field for them, because the government of the Philippines does not charge any fees. And then there's also, but we need to look at why companies aren't using it, given that it's so less expensive. No, even the companies that are owning up and paying for recruitment costs. One of the things that people are saying is how you get, the prerequisite of being able to use the direct hiring program. It's very difficult. I mean, how do you get the visa quotas, right? That by itself is very difficult to do. And the government needs to be less obscure about the process for getting that and making sure that it's easier to get. Because if a company has to go and get it themselves and bypass the broker system, then, tell me how to do it, or else I would just rather pay. These are the obstacles that we need to address. How do you create that? What information needs to go out? What needs to be made less complicated for companies to use it? The other thing that's stopping that's stopping people from using it really is the fact that there are a lot of people who earn from recruitment. I mean, let's face it. There's a lot of anecdotal data from labor agencies in the Philippines and Indonesia that I've talked to, who say that there's a pay to play in Taiwan, right? To be able to get a job order in Taiwan, you have to pay the recruitment agencies in Taiwan or the employers in Taiwan enormous amounts of money. So the Indonesian agents that I talked to, they said, oh, we can't send to Taiwan. It's too expensive for us. It's $3,000 US. And it's cheaper for the Philippines. They're paying $2,000 US because they have more leverage, because the Taiwanese want the Filipino workers. But those are the things that we need to address, and that we need to look at. I mean, more of the practical, procedural things. What information needs to be out there? How much does it cost to get a visa quota? How much are the visas? How do I get them? How many days does it take to do that? Those things, if the Taiwan government made that more clear, then you'd have more people looking to do more direct hiring. Without that, people will stay within the same in the status quo. And
yeah,
what else?
Thank you, Maria.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I mean, I just thought it's always a good place to park, on hope. So we all, this collective audience, we all feel like we can still do something. I think what is really interested in your remark is the fact that you seem to think the bilateral direct hiring platform can be improved, right? And that it could be a viable alternative to the current brokerage structure. That seems to be, a little bit different from Lennon's, because it implies that it could be fixed in some ways. But so that's my first observation. And the second one is you spoke a lot about corporate levers, pressure that we can put to business. And we had a great question that just came up on the chat on, well, do you see any difference in the various sectors who are more receptive to direct hiring? And so that's the question that came from the chat. And the last point is, you spoke of the huge fees that brokers in the Philippines have to pay. I think a good point to start is the report by FairSquare. Just do a find kickbacks, right? And then you'll find, I think that's how the report called it. It's
Yes.
the fees that we cannot see, but is,
Yes.
flown between different places. So can I just ask you to quickly provide your observations on, what sectors are more receptive? Where can we start?
Yeah, and just to be clear, when I said that there are things that need to be fixed in the direct hiring program. But Lennon is right. People need the government needs to be sincere in that effort to do that. So when I was talking about quota systems, when I was talking about those types of systems, I was thinking more about Lennon's alternative, which is nonprofit agencies going into this. Now, they would face that same issue about getting how to get a visa quota, how to get that process going to get the job order. So those are things that for the other alternative, the private sector alternative that Lennon talked about, those things need to be set in place. So that more agencies like Lennon could address those, could operate. Now, what's your question again, Bonnie?
Well, just quickly, what sectors are already using direct hiring? I guess, yes, I think we all know the answer, but I just want you to say it.
Electronics, yes, electronics. So the companies that I know that have gone through the direct hiring program and have gone to POEA are from electronics, but I know that there are also some apparel and food companies that have long used that avenue. And there are, it just takes an investment of time of the management to really understand the procedures for how to do it, and to also, because you're not using a broker anymore or an agency, you have to have the people in place internally that will replace that will do the job or the roles that the broker originally undertook. So those companies actually invested in that. So and have the staff to do it. So
thank you so much, Maria. I think we'll come back to a lot of your points in the Q&A, but I just want to stress that there are sectors that are already using fair recruitment, and we see that most prominently in the electronic supply chains, given brands' concerns. And I know that many of them are in the leadership group for responsible recruitment that have been pressing this for quite some time. And the hope is always that that will have spillover effect to other sectors. You mentioned agriculture, textile, and but let me go back to the point you said about commitment from authorities in Taiwan to better recruitment. And I think, this is a great kind of flow to our next speaker, who is a local politician and maybe can speak a bit on this directly. Our next speaker is Chen Wenxue. He is a Miaoli County Councillor, which is the legislative body for the county of Miaoli. Now, Miaoli is a county that's nestled between Taichung in the middle of the island and Taipei to the north. And Miaoli County's development has generally lagged behind the more prosperous counties as its neighbors. Now, Councillor Chen took up his term in 2018. He is an independent politician and graduated with a degree in sociology. Now, most people outside of Taiwan would not have heard of Miaoli County. Apologies to the residents of Miaoli. But over the summer, the county became notoriously known for the way that county authorities treated its migrant workers by ordering very strict movement restrictions for its migrant worker populations, restrictions that were harsher than for the general population and that were not mandated by Center Disease Control. Now, migrant workers, even those who worked in domestic care, were prohibited from going outside initially, and with the exception of going and returning from work. Now, this was backed by very harsh rhetoric against migrant workers that painted them as irresponsible vectors of disease transmission. Now, however, there was also a counter movement. There was a very moving petition circulated by some local residents who said, we all share the same fate. They openly thanked the migrant workers for staying in a county that has seen a mass exodus to the cities and for giving Miaoli a new lease of life. Now, Councillor Chen was one of the few public figures who openly used their platform to increase awareness for the precarious working and living conditions of migrant factory workers and has spoken up for their rights. So Miaoli may not be known well internationally, but what happened there during the summer has made it a little bit of a symbol for what I see as the situation of migrant rights in Taiwan, which is that certainly it's not good enough, but there's potential for growing awareness and change. So with that opening, I would like to ask Councillor Chen, now, when Taiwan went through its COVID spike in the summer and went through the near lockdown, the near full lockdowns, migrant rights came under a focus for the way that employers, brokers, and some of the local authorities in Miaoli treated them by imposing such harsh movement restrictions. Now, you were notable in speaking up for them, for migrant workers. Can you maybe tell us a little bit why you did so? And why were such voices in the minority for the local officials? And in general, what do you think the authorities can do to protect migrant workers in Miaoli so such incidents will not happen again in the future? Thank you, Councillor Chen.
好，谢谢邦尼。然后首先谢谢所有在线上一起与会的人权以及移工的先进们，然后还有各位线上的朋友。那如同邦尼刚才所说，苗栗其实过去在国际上面不一定是一个这么被认识的城市。我们位在台湾的中部。那这一次的事件呢，主要就是台湾在过去从2020年 COVID-19 肆虐全球以来，台湾其实在疫情的防守上面做得非常的好。但是呢，到今年大概5月左右开始有一波大规模的感染。那一开始呢，都是在比较大的城市。在开头的时候，苗栗其实状况相对的比较好，因为我们的是一个比较乡村型的都市。但是呢，我的选区我所在的位置，为什么会发生这样的事情？主要是因为我们在台湾一个非常的重要的科学园区的旁边。那这个科学园区，它不只是有本地的晶片厂，不只是有本地的科技厂，同时呢，这些产业移工们有非常多的外籍移工朋友们是担任这些工厂里面的员工。那他们的生活环境以及他们就业的环境，导致一旦疫情传散开来之后，会产生非常严重的群聚感染，因为他们在工厂里面的距离是非常的近的，同时公司配发给他们的口罩是没有办法防范病毒的，它只是一个无尘式的一般的纯白口罩，并不是医疗级的口罩。同时在他们的宿舍里面，他们大部分可能是6到8个人一间，然后每一层楼之间其实又是没有隔开，然后各个厂之间又是没有做阻断，同时跟其他的公司之间又会有所交流。所以当一位移工感染之后，他的整间的室友、整栋的宿舍、整个公司，甚至跟他同乡的其他平常会交流、会聚会的其他公司的员工都会感染。所以在今年的夏天，大概6月的时候，苗栗的晶圆厂发生了非常严重的群聚感染，数百人、数千人的被隔离，那几乎是让整个苗栗的卫生单位无法处理，陷入了一个失控的状况。那在这个时候呢，我们中央的 CDC 疫情指挥中心就派了指挥官下来，希望可以对苗栗的疫情来做一个控制。那苗栗县政府一开始是以一个非常配合的方式跟指挥官这边来配合。那 因为指挥官的这个控制的方式非常得当，一波一波的去控制筛检，把还有病毒的人或者是还有可能有疑虑的人一波一波的筛检，那最后状况整个稳定下。但是在这个中间的阶段呢，苗栗县政府自己做了一个政策上的决定，就是所有的外籍移工除了上班时间，通通不准外出。那这是一个非常违反人权，然后非常我觉得不正确的做法。县政府为什么会这么做？他们的目的只有一个，因为当时的移工的群聚感染，也同时让少部分的本地的员工也做了也有感染到。那当时造成的恐慌是大家把移工等于病毒的带源者。那这个状况其实是非常的不友善，而且是很大的一个刻板印象跟对移工朋友们的污名化。因为病毒是不会选择国籍的，之所以移工朋友们会有一个比较大的群聚感染，主要是来自于他们的生活环境是没有办法做到隔离以及防疫的，他们全部都住在一起，都享有共同的卫浴，所以一旦有一个人感染，他会非常大规模的去扩散。那这个样子的情形其实不只是发生在移工，一旦比如说住宿型的学校，或者是军队，或者是其他的这种有宿舍型的地方，一旦发生感染，都会是一样子的状况。所以我们不应该特别的去针对移工。但是呢，因为我觉得我们的县政府对于移工政策的不友善以及不了解，导致他们用了一个最便宜形式、最简单的方式来阻隔，做实体上的阻隔。那这个目的就是要让乡亲们、让我们的县民们在路上看不到东南亚的面孔，让民众们放心。但是这是一个错误的政策，它不只是带来污名化，同时对于防疫来说是没有任何的帮助的。那这个政策一开始是直接说外籍移工通通都不准在工作之外的时间上街，这有一个问题是，连白领移工、连其他国籍的移工通通都受到限制。那后来县政府在我们批评了之后，改变了说他们只针对蓝领移工。接着再发生另外一个问题，蓝领移工里面还有产业移工跟社福移工，就是在家里面从事看护的这些移工。这些移工如果都不能够出门的话，他们的这些照顾者、机构里面的或者是家里面的老人家，如果要买菜、要拿药、要采买生活的物资，通通都不行。那这些老人家如果在家里面发生了什么状况，其实是担当不起的。而且这些在家里面的移工跟工厂里面的移工不一定是有接触的，所以一概而论的全部禁止是错误的。那经过这个批评之后，县政府又再一次修正说，他们只针对工厂里面的移工，也就是说，县政府的这个政策完全没有在做防疫的考量，它其实就是单纯的想要去限缩他们觉得风险高的人群。那这些人其实他在即使他们是有风险，他们回到工作场域之后，跟本地的劳工还是会有接触，可是本地的台湾劳工却不会受到任何的限制。那这个中间不公平的对待，就是我们认为不止在防疫上面是一个错误的，同时也会加深外籍移工跟本地的社群之间的一个隔阂，所以才会希望我们的县政府能够赶快收回这个样子的命令。同时有一点非常重要的是，我们的中央政府 CDC 指挥中心其实有公开的说，苗栗县政府的这个措施是他们不允许的。但是呢，县政府依然没有收回这个措施，他们只有在疫情相对趋缓的时候才把它解除，所以我们的移工朋友遭受了将近1个月非常不人道的对待。那在这中间发生了很多的插曲，他们在隔离他们，在禁止他们的过程中，发生了他们的私人物品被堆置在像垃圾堆一样被丢弃，然后他们的很多的生活上面的权利受限，同时他们吃的东西非常的糟糕。那这个我们在这中间的过程中都有协助的来反映。那为什么我们会这么在意这个问题呢？因为对我来说，对我这个世代的政治工作者来说，台湾要面对中国的在国际上面的各种打压，我觉得台湾最重要的一个核心价值就是我们对于民主自由的追求以及认可。那我们对于人权的这个重视，其实应该是台湾非常重要的一个价值。但是在这件事情上面，我们的县政府却展现出让人没有办法接受的政策。那再加上台湾其实在少子化以及人口老化非常严重， 我们有非常多的工作，其实应该是要由青壮人口来负担的工作，是没有人愿意做的。那是透过非常大量的移工朋友们来协助，才让台湾的社会能够维持一个正常的运作。那对于这些从国外远道而来到台湾的朋友们来说，其实他们就是来工作，我们不应该把他们当成用完即丢的劳动力。我觉得在台湾现在的法规跟我们的政府有时候在对他们的态度，以及台湾人在看待东南亚面孔的移工的时候，很容易落入这个样子的状况，好像他们来台湾3年、9年之后就回去，那好像不是在台湾，他们好像不是一个人，而是一个我用完之后就可以请他们回去母国的劳动力。那这并不是一个我们所期待看到的台湾社会。我们希望国外的朋友们来这边工作，获得他们应有的报酬。那同时，他们待在台湾的这些时间，他们应该是要有尊严，然后并且能够喜欢台湾这个地方的这个样子的工作环境。所以呢，在为他们的劳动权益争取，不只是为他们的权益提升，同时我觉得也是让台湾的社会跟台湾的文化能够迈向更国际、更多元、更民主自由。所以不只是帮助他们，我也期待台湾的整个社会环境能够往前跨出一个重要的一步。那为什么帮这些忙的政治人物会是少数呢？我想第一个点是这些移工朋友们是没有办法投票的。那对于政治人物来说，选票会是他们选择议题上面一个重要的考量。那再加上语言跟国籍的问题，这些移工朋友们他们可能会跟自己国家的办事处来反映问题，那可能他们没有这个管道能够跟在地的政治人物来连接上，然后没有办法跟他们澄清。那但是呢，在今年夏天，就是因为这些来到台湾的政治人物们，这些来到台湾的移工朋友们，他们其实不只是来工作，他们很多人可能跟台湾人处在交往关系，或者是已经变成非常好的朋友。那是这些台湾的员工们帮忙把他们的声音告诉我，然后我来帮忙发声之后，又转回去他们的社群、他们的 SNS 上面。所以这些不管是菲律宾、越南或者是印尼等等的朋友们，在他们自己的社群上面看到了我们帮他们说话，那就开始有很多英文的讯息来告诉我们他们所遇到的状况。接着我们就在不同的事件协助他们发声，协助改善。那在经过了这一次的事件之后呢，县政府在对他们，我觉得只要我们有反应，他们都会立刻赶快的去改善。那同时在台湾的
Councillor Chen，谢谢您，谢谢您，因为我们刚刚看，对不起 ，sorry， I just want to say thank you so much for your remarks. I just want to say we have had a few comments on the chat of people thanking you for your very and passionate, advocacy for migrant workers. You talked about ways where authorities could improve the situation of migrant rights. You talked about information, the flow of information. You said that once information was received, for example, once you received them, you were able to publicize and urge others to take action. So I think that's one mechanism where local authorities, the role of government as a lever to improve the situation of migrant rights. I just want to quickly, because I'm mindful of the time, we have had a question that came up asking, is it effective to put pressure on Taiwanese authorities? Does it work to name and shame, given that you do have local, central authorities at, for example, at the Ministry of Labor, who seem to be welcoming of the report? And what's the best type of advocacy strategy there? If you don't, this is from Isabel Chen, lecturer at
台湾这次的过程中，我觉得透过民意代表以及媒体的发声会是有效的。那像是这一次能够让国际上面像在场的这么多的朋友们注意到苗栗的状况，其实就是我们帮他们把这些事情揭露之后，有很多的不管是台湾的媒体还是国际的媒体都看到这一块，那政府其实就会有压力了。那尤其是我们是作为监督这个地方政府的民意代表，我们对于地方政府是有一定程度的影响力，政府也会重视我们的意见。所以如果只是移工朋友们自己在他们的社群网站上面发声， 政府不一定会看到。那透过民意代表的协助去要求政府改变，我觉得在这一次的事件中看起来是一个蛮实际直接的协助。
Thank you very much for that quick answer. So there is room for name and shame. There's room for very detailed research exemplified by Nick's report. So time is short, but let me just go through some of the questions that have come up. We have one from Arvin Joyce from University of Leicester. Are businesses not using direct hiring program because they receive kickbacks from the recruiting agencies? And related to that is, are brokers being used for all levels of migrant workers, or is it just focused purely on low skilled workers? Can I have maybe Ellen to take that question on what is your view? Are or Maria, actually, both of you, what do you see as the reason for businesses not using direct hiring? And then we go back to the question of why do we have this differentiated recruitment system based on skill?
Yeah, okay. I put some answers in the chat box, but based on our interaction or communication exchanges with our partners in Taiwan, one reason that the employers are not so keen to go through the direct hiring process is because they would end up covering all the costs that would be required to recruit and have the worker under their employ. Whereas in the current broker system, they can pass on some of the costs to the workers through these regular monthly fees that are allowed to be deducted from the workers' wages. But the other thing is, and probably this is on the part of the Philippine government, the sending government, is in the Philippines, we have a joint and several liability provision between the foreign employer and the local recruiters. So whatever goes wrong in the duration of the work contract, and the worker is not able to address it in the country of destination, like in Taiwan, they can go after the recruiter in the Philippines. So for their money claims, any and all money claims. So probably that's one reason why they would still prefer or encourage, because right now our labor law restricts direct hiring itself. So yeah, so if it's the situation here, and then in the case of the Taiwan, they're promoting it already, but then you're not able to address the legal barriers in this case, then it becomes problematic, as we heard also from Lennon, that currently it doesn't seem to be working. No, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen. We seem to be circling back to problems of direct hiring. We have another observation here by Isabel Chen, who is an expert on Taiwan migration with a focus on those in the domestic care sector. And I know that Nick, you have a question on domestic care as well. But her observation is that Taiwanese subsidiaries of global brands were asked by their contractors to use direct hiring. But the Taiwanese suppliers complained that that this increased their management cost because they cannot outsource all of their responsibilities to broker. And it turned out that in reality, because of the increased cost, they continue to use brokers, and direct hiring is only restricted to recruit their foreign employees. So I think, you know, we're going back to the discussion we had between Lennon and Maria on, we do have this bilateral direct hiring platform. In principle, it looks like it could ensure fair recruitment, but it's not being implemented well. It's hugely bureaucratic. Very difficult to understand. And, you know, most people, whether or not they're employing a migrant domestic worker or factory worker, they end up using a broker just for the ease of the administrative burden. Okay, now let's take some questions. Now, Nick, I know you have a question on domestic care workers. And I think that's important that we kind of, you know, spotlight that as well. Do you want to ask your question to the panelists?
Yeah, it's just, I think it's easy for this issue to get lost. You know, there's a lot of focus on distant water fishing. There's a lot of talk about the sort of corporate driven focus on electronics. We understand that, you know, we see the microchip shortage, for example, that's happening, and we understand why that's happening. But there are hundreds of thousands of foreign domestic workers in Taiwan. I just want to quote out this is why the Taiwanese government says they do not enjoy labour law protection. It says their duties, work hours and rest hours are clearly different from workers of business entities, making it hard to draw a clear line between what is work and what is not. I just want, that is entirely inconsistent with Taiwan's reputation and with the reputation that it wants to have, as the councillor outlined very articulately. I just wanted to ask our Taiwan expert, why is this approach taken to domestic workers? What can we attribute this to? Is this part of the social stigmatization that the councillor mentioned? I'd be interested in your thoughts, and to be honest, yours as well, Bonnie, if you felt like stepping away from your moderating.
Lennon, would you like to take that first, and maybe the councillor then as well?
Yeah, so let me clarify. The question is how can we help to change the situation of the domestic workers as a whole, right? In general.
Why are they recruited, excluded from labor, basic labor protections? What is the reason for excluding them?
There is also a history. Yeah, there is also a history of the evolution. Actually, on the contrary of what you said, what you said is true, but actually on the contrary, from our general impression, the domestic workers has been included in the Labor Standard Act for 8 months before, but they were excluded again. That's one of the very few examples. So why? The reason is very clear. That's from the complaints from the employers and brokers, because there is a cap of working hours per day, 12 hours per day, and there's a cap of overtime per month, 46 hours, which is totally impossible for the domestic workers. So if they really enforce the law, it means all the employers will be either totally illegal, or they have to pay more overtime than the real salary to the domestic workers. So that couldn't be. So what we always demand, and not only us, all the migrant NGOs demand the government to take more resources to the long-term caring system. And so the domestic workers, especially the caretakers, actually more than 99% of the domestic workers in Taiwan are caretakers. They should be covered by the long-term caring. And I always think the government should take more business tax from the companies. Our business tax in Taiwan is one of the lowest in the world. That's one of the reasons why government doesn't have enough money to do the long-term caring, which end up that most families, they don't have too many choices but to hire a migrant domestic worker to take care of their elders. So that's my quick answer. Thanks.
Now, if I can quickly jump in, I think it's important to kind of also look at the historical context, because this is not a contemporary phenomenon. I mean, if we look at the historical literature on human trafficking, in the beginning, the focus of the League of Nations or the UN was focused on exploitation in the home setting in the Chinese context. So there's a perception that work at home is not work. It's a duty. It's a duty for the family, and because it's a duty for the family, it's not an employment relationship. But of course, it is an employment relationship. But it's a difficult grain to cut against. But so that's my short introduction. But Councillor Zhen, would you like to speak about why domestic care workers are excluded from basic labor protection quickly?
我想，主要就是因为这些员工跟雇主其实生活在一起，那你非常的难去切断以及定义他们什么样的状况是上班跟下班的时间。比如说，刚才我有提到他做菜、帮家里扫地、煮饭、出门买东西等等的时间，那其实都是上班的内容。那但是假设他今天有一个明确的上下班时段，即使下班之后家里如果有发生了什么样的事情的时候，他其实依然需要协助。那这个部分就会变成劳基法在这个形态的工作人员上面非常的难以去实践。那同时还有，因为这些员工们这些移工们、家庭看护工们跟雇主跟主要的看护者住在一起，其实会有相当程度的权力关系在这里面。那在他们的生活上，那尤其是 他们整个生活是很密切的在一起，不只是工作，那尤其是在家里的各种状况。那尤其是我们其实过去也会发现，如果要按照法规上面来去切断工作以及下班的时间，真的是非常困难难以实行。所以这样子一个特别的类型，在实务上面的确很难用现行的劳基法去限制他们。
Thank you. Well, we're approaching the end of the webinar. There's still some questions coming up, and I just want to highlight some of the things that have come up. One, there's one comment about the mental health effect of these quasi-lockdown movement restrictions on migrant workers. I think that's very important. There was I think the Taoyuan mayor, or was it Hsinchu mayor? I don't remember, but he also gave a talk about why to the public, to the Taiwan public, you think you're afraid of COVID? Imagine being a migrant worker in another land and facing the pandemic. So I thought, these voices are few, but they need to be amplified so that we can pull that lever that Councillor Zhen, talked about earlier. We have another question. I think that's quite good as a place where we can leave the discussion for today, which is the one going back to Marie. Can you highlight some of the policies that have worked as a lever for companies to change their policies on migrant recruitment? And what are some of these positive examples that we can cite from other countries in the context of Taiwan? So I'll let you take that, and then I'll wrap up with some observations. Thank you, Marie.
So there are a number of legislative levers right now, and I think I mentioned the U.S. Tariffs Act. There's also, what preceded the Modern Slavery Act in the UK and the Modern Slavery Act in Australia, which was the California Transparency in Supply Chains Law. All of these have focused on businesses, though. They've focused on their scrutiny on business to ensure that there is no forced labor in their supply chains. It hasn't really, but these are legislation that's set by these governments to direct how business behaves. I don't know how whether Taiwan would be, how that impacts on Taiwan, but it certainly impacts on Taiwanese businesses that send to these destinations, right? So Taiwanese employers that might be in the supply chain of electronics or fishing. I think fishing is becoming a big area of scrutiny for the CBP right now. They've moved from putting WROs or a withhold release order on vessel by vessel, and are now focusing on companies, trading companies. So and some of the biggest trading companies are Taiwanese, right? And they are the ones that buy from the vessels that hire the workers, the seafarers that Nick has been talking about in distant water fishing. And so so some of these levers can be used to buy, and advocacy groups like Greenpeace and WWF have been using these levers to get the CBP, for example, to look into certain types of companies that they believe have forced labor issues. So as Verite, we've been receiving a lot of interest from companies to say, how do we address this, Marie? We're getting this scrutiny now. So how do we address this? And I always say, look, start paying for recruitment costs. Start making sure that your suppliers pay for recruitment costs. Because right now, all of the companies that were placed, that had a WRO order are scrambling to pay their workers back, scrambling, and then begging, asking a number of audit firms to assure that their repayments have been kosher, have been up to standard, that they're paying workers back properly. So that's one, the repayments. But I think what we need to move towards is really making these companies pay for recruitment costs in the first place. And I think it's important to note that when they are repaying workers, when companies are repaying workers because they didn't pay for the recruitment costs initially, it increases their cost because they pay for the cost of exploitation. For example, to bring a worker to Taiwan, it costs maybe $1,200 to bring a worker to Taiwan. But if you're paying a worker back for what they were charged, you have to pay back $3,000. So it's cheaper to start paying first. Yeah.
Well, Marie, thank you for that statement, kind of painting this complex interaction, between authorities, levers that authorities can use, businesses, advocacy groups, but also the geographic dimension, right? It's where we're not just talking about sending and destination. We're also looking at, countries like the US and the EU also can do, levers that we can pull at their end. I think your intervention actually paints very well that this is the beginning of a very long dialogue, right? This is the first webinar, but it cannot be where we stop because there's so many details to tease out. But let me wrap up by showing, by saying that we asked participants when they signed up on, what was their feeling for where the stronger lever lied, in terms of bringing about fair recruitment for the Philippine-Taiwan corridor. And 30 people said both. And then beyond that, it was evenly divided, another 15 said the Philippines and another 15 said Taiwan. I thought that was a very interesting spread. Now, I think going forward, it'd be interesting, for all of us to reflect, have we changed that assessment? Where do we think the lever is in terms of bringing about recruitment changes in these corridors that we have, that we examined today? But Philippines-Taiwan is not the only corridor. There are many others, and I will, let Nick talk about another one shortly. But before we wrap up, I just want to thank all of you, everyone today, the panelists and the participants, for this very rich discussion. Thank you so much for your time and for joining and sharing your very frank thoughts with us. I would also like the Herculean efforts of the comms team for putting this together. So much work went into this to make it run like this today. I would like to thank the interpreter. It's very hard to do simultaneous interpretation, and you did that for 90 minutes straight, Howard. Thank you so much. So without further ado, let's keep talking. You know how to find us. Let's keep talking, and let's make sure that the vision of ethical recruitment comes in our lifetime. So Nick, tell us about the next corridor.
Yeah, so Howard, thank you. Bonnie, thank you. Everyone else, thank you. Yeah, we're hoping to do further webinars. We're hoping to do one on the Gulf states and possibly one focusing on North America. So those will be happening in probably next year. We might also be having one looking at another of the Asian corridors that was under study, which would be of interest to people here. So yes, please watch this space or other similar spaces.
All right, goodbye everyone. Thank you for joining.
Thanks.
Thank you, Bonnie.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, IHRB. Bye. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, everyone. Particular thanks to Bonnie. Fantastic.
Thanks, Bonnie. That was great.
Oh my goodness, you guys, fantastic.
Yeah, thanks IHRB and FairSquare, Nick and Bonnie, and thanks a lot. Bye bye. Thanks.
Thanks
谢谢
for
大
coming
家。
on,
Keep in
Lana.
touch.
谢谢，
Thank you,
谢谢您。
Chancellor.
Share.